You gave my college fund to Ethan, Daniel Carter said quietly, staring across the dinner table. All $187,000. The words hung in the air like something fragile that might shatter if anyone breathed too loudly. Robert Carter didn't answer right away. He simply set his fork down beside his plate of roast chicken and folded his hands together as if Daniel had just asked about the weather. Linda Carter glanced briefly toward the hallway, where Ethan's backpack leaned against the wall, then back at her son with a look that was meant to be calm but only made the silence heavier. Daniel had expected confusion, maybe even denial. What he hadn't expected was the stillness. The Carter dining room was small but carefully kept, the kind of room where family photos lined the walls, and the same oak table had been used for every birthday, holiday, and graduation dinner for more than 20 years. Daniel had grown up believing that table was where important things were shared honestly. Tonight it felt like a courtroom. Outside, the late summer evening in the small Ohio town of Willow Creek was quiet, the kind of quiet that usually made Daniel feel safe. Crickets hummed somewhere beyond the open window, and the faint smell of freshly cut grass drifted in from the neighbor's yard. But inside the house, nothing felt familiar anymore. Daniel looked from his father to his mother, waiting for one of them to laugh and say this had all been a misunderstanding. Instead, Robert cleared his throat. "Daniel," he said slowly, "you need to understand something." That sentence alone made Daniel's chest tighten. He had heard that tone before, usually when his parents had already decided something and were about to explain why he needed to accept it. "Your brother has a very demanding program ahead of him," Robert continued. "Medical school isn't cheap." Daniel blinked. For a moment, he honestly thought he had misheard. "Dad," he said, his voice almost steady, "that was my college fund." Linda finally spoke, her voice soft but firm in the way only mothers could manage. "Your brother has a remarkable opportunity," she said. "Sometimes families have to make practical choices." Practical choices. Daniel repeated the phrase silently in his mind. For 18 years he had been told the account existed for his future. Every birthday check from relatives, every summer job paycheck he had partly saved, every small contribution from his grandmother Margaret had gone into that fund. $187,000. Enough for tuition, housing, and the chance to start adulthood without crushing debt. Daniel remembered the first time his father had shown him the account statement when he turned 16. "This is your head start," Robert had said proudly back then. Daniel had believed him completely. Now the same man sat across from him explaining that the money had simply been redirected like a piece of furniture moved into another room. "You didn't even tell me," Daniel said quietly. Ethan's name hung between them like an explanation everyone expected Daniel to accept automatically. Ethan Carter was 2 years younger, brilliant in school, confident, and the center of nearly every proud story Linda told her friends. Daniel had always known Ethan was the favorite in subtle ways, but he had never imagined the difference went this far. Robert finally looked directly at him. "You'll figure things out," he said. "You're resourceful." The words were meant to sound encouraging, but they landed with a strange emptiness. Daniel felt something inside him shift, something quiet but permanent. Because in that moment, he realized the conversation wasn't about misunderstanding or apology. The decision had already been made long before tonight. His future had been quietly traded for his brother's. And the most unsettling part was how normal his parents seemed while telling him. Daniel Carter did not finish his dinner that night. The plate sat untouched in front of him long after his parents had cleared their own dishes and moved casually around the kitchen as if the conversation had been about something ordinary, like weekend plans or grocery lists. He could hear the running water in the sink and the quiet clink of plates being stacked together. For a moment Daniel remained at the table, staring at the faint scratches in the oak surface that he had noticed 1,000 times growing up, but had never really looked at closely. It was strange how ordinary everything looked when something inside his life had suddenly shifted. Finally, he stood up and walked upstairs without saying another word. His bedroom was exactly the same as it had been that morning. The same posters on the wall, the same desk near the window, the same stack of college brochures he had spent months studying carefully. The small town of Willow Creek spread quietly outside the glass, streetlights glowing softly along the sidewalks, and the familiar outline of the water tower visible in the distance. Daniel had always imagined leaving this town for college with a sense of excitement, not with the heavy feeling now settling into his chest. He sat down on the edge of his bed and opened his laptop slowly. The college account information had been bookmarked in his browser for years. His parents had always encouraged him to check it from time to time, telling him it was important to understand how planning for the future worked. Daniel typed the password he had memorized long ago and waited for the page to load. When the numbers appeared on the screen, he felt the same disbelief he had felt at the dinner table. The balance showed $0.00. Underneath the account summary was a long list of transactions stretching back nearly 2 years. Transfers, withdrawals, payments. Each line looked small and harmless by itself, but together they told a story that Daniel had never been meant to notice. The total added up exactly to $187,000. Daniel leaned back in his chair and rubbed his hands across his face slowly. What unsettled him most was not only that the money was gone, but how long it had been disappearing without him realizing it. 2 years. During those same 2 years, he had worked weekends at the local hardware store, stocking shelves and helping customers load lumber into pickup trucks. He had told himself the extra savings would help with books and housing expenses later. The memory now felt strangely distant, like he had been working toward a future that had quietly been erased. His phone vibrated on the desk beside him. For a second, Daniel considered ignoring it, but the screen showed a name that made him pause. Margaret Carter. His grandmother rarely called late at night unless something was important. Daniel answered the call and lifted the phone to his ear. The warm, familiar voice of his grandmother filled the quiet room. She asked him gently if everything was all right, because she had spoken with his mother earlier that evening, and something about the conversation had not sounded quite right. Daniel hesitated before responding, searching for the right words to explain something that still did not feel completely real. He told her about the dinner, about the account, about the number that now read 0 where his future had once been written. There was silence on the other end of the line for several seconds. When Margaret finally spoke again, her voice had changed slightly, calm but thoughtful in a way Daniel recognized from years of listening to her tell stories about the town and the people who lived in it. She said something that made Daniel sit up straighter in his chair. She said that several years earlier she had personally deposited $50,000 into that same account because she wanted to help her oldest grandson start his life without unnecessary obstacles. Daniel stared at the screen again as those words settled slowly in his mind. Because if what his grandmother had just said was true, then the missing money was not only his parents' decision. It was a secret that had been hidden from more than one person. Daniel Carter did not sleep much that night. After his grandmother ended the call, he remained seated at the desk, the soft glow of the laptop screen illuminating the quiet room while the rest of the house had already gone dark. Outside the window, the town of Willow Creek looked calm and unchanged, but Daniel could not shake the uneasy thought that the world he believed he understood had quietly shifted without warning. His grandmother's words kept repeating in his mind. $50,000. She had placed that money into the account herself years earlier. Daniel remembered the day clearly now. He had been 17 and Margaret Carter had taken him to lunch at the small diner near the courthouse square. She had congratulated him on his grades and told him she believed education opened doors that nothing else could. At the time, Daniel had assumed the lunch was simply one of her thoughtful gestures. He had never realized she had quietly invested such a large amount into his future. The realization settled heavily in his chest, because if Margaret had contributed that money with the understanding that it was meant for him, then the situation was no longer just a family decision made at the dinner table. It meant that something had been hidden from her as well. Daniel closed the laptop slowly and leaned back in the chair, staring toward the dark ceiling while the silence of the house pressed in around him. Down the hallway, he could hear the faint creak of the floor as someone moved, probably his father getting a glass of water before going to bed. Everything sounded ordinary. That was what made it so unsettling. A normal house on a quiet street with a secret that suddenly felt much larger than a missing college fund. The next morning arrived with the pale gray light of early autumn filtering through Daniel's curtains. He woke later than usual and lay still for a moment, half hoping the conversation from the previous night had only been a strange dream. But the memory returned immediately. The numbers on the screen. His father's calm explanation. His mother's quiet words about practical choices. Daniel sat up slowly and looked at the brochures scattered across his desk again. Universities from Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. For years he had imagined choosing between them based on which campus felt right. Now the decision seemed to have already been made without him. His phone buzzed again on the nightstand. Another call from Margaret Carter. Daniel answered quickly this time. His grandmother sounded composed, but there was a careful seriousness in her voice that Daniel recognized from moments when she was thinking through something important. She asked him to come by her house later that afternoon because there were details she wanted to discuss in person rather than over the phone. Daniel agreed immediately. Margaret lived only 15 minutes away on the edge of town in a small white house surrounded by tall maple trees that had been there longer than most of the families in Willow Creek. Daniel had spent countless weekends there as a child, listening to her stories about the town and the generations that had grown up within it. As he ended the call, Daniel felt a new sense of determination beginning to replace the confusion from the night before. Because if his grandmother had placed $50,000 into that account and had not been told what happened to it, then the story his parents had presented at dinner might not be the full truth. And Margaret Carter was not the kind of person who ignored unanswered questions. Daniel Carter arrived at his grandmother's house shortly after 2 in the afternoon, the familiar gravel driveway crunching softly beneath the tires of his car. The house stood exactly as it always had, small but carefully maintained, its white siding bright beneath the clear Ohio sky, and the tall maple trees around it beginning to show the first hints of autumn color. Daniel had visited this place countless times growing up, yet today the quiet property felt different, as if he were stepping into a conversation that had already begun without him. Margaret Carter opened the front door before he even reached the porch steps, as if she had been watching through the window for his arrival. She greeted him with the same warm smile she always carried, but Daniel noticed the thoughtful seriousness in her eyes. Inside, the house smelled faintly of fresh coffee and the cinnamon candles she liked to keep near the kitchen window. Everything looked orderly and calm. The same photographs on the shelves, the same comfortable chairs near the living room fireplace, where Daniel had once listened to her tell stories about the town and the families who had lived there for generations. Margaret gestured for him to sit at the kitchen table, placing 2 mugs of coffee between them before taking her seat across from him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet was not uncomfortable, but it carried the sense that both of them understood the conversation ahead would not be simple. Finally, Margaret folded her hands together on the table and looked directly at Daniel. She asked him to tell her again exactly what his parents had said the night before. Daniel repeated the conversation slowly, choosing his words carefully. He explained how the account balance had reached 0 and how his father had described the decision as a practical choice made for Ethan's future. Margaret listened without interrupting, her expression calm but increasingly focused as the details unfolded. When Daniel finished speaking, she nodded slowly, as though confirming something she had already begun to suspect. She then stood up and walked to a wooden cabinet along the wall, opening a drawer and removing a neatly organized folder. When she returned to the table, she placed the folder between them and opened it carefully. Inside were copies of documents, bank confirmations, and a printed receipt dated several years earlier. Margaret slid the top page toward Daniel. The document clearly showed a transfer of $50,000 into the same college account Daniel had checked the night before. The date matched the lunch they had shared at the diner near the courthouse square. Margaret spoke quietly but firmly as Daniel studied the page. She explained that when she made the deposit, she had done so with a specific condition written in the documentation. The funds were intended only for Daniel's education and were not meant to be redirected for any other purpose. Daniel felt a slow tightening in his chest as he read the lines again. The words were clear and unmistakable. Margaret leaned back in her chair and looked at him thoughtfully. She said she had not been informed that the money had been removed from the account, and she had certainly not approved any change in how it was used. Daniel looked up from the documents, realizing that what had first seemed like a painful family disagreement might actually be something far more complicated. Margaret Carter was known throughout Willow Creek as someone who paid close attention to details and rarely made decisions without careful planning. If she had written conditions into that deposit years earlier, then the disappearance of the money was not simply a private family matter anymore. It meant that the story Daniel had been given at the dinner table was only part of a much larger picture, and Margaret Carter had already begun quietly examining the rest of it. Daniel remained silent for a long moment after reading the document his grandmother had placed in front of him. The printed confirmation felt heavier than its thin sheet of paper suggested. $50,000 had not simply been a gift. It had been a carefully placed investment with a clear purpose. Margaret Carter watched him closely across the kitchen table, her calm expression unchanged but her eyes observant in a way that made Daniel realize she had already begun thinking several steps ahead. The quiet ticking of the wall clock filled the room for a few seconds before she spoke again. She explained that when she had arranged the transfer years earlier, she had done it through a local financial office that had handled several matters for their family in the past. The account had been set up specifically under Daniel's name as a designated education fund, and the paperwork included conditions that the money would remain reserved for that purpose. Margaret said she had trusted that arrangement completely because the account had appeared stable every time she received the annual summary statements in the mail. Daniel looked up quickly at that detail. He asked if she still received those statements. Margaret nodded slowly and reached again into the folder, removing another sheet of paper. This one showed a statement from nearly 18 months earlier. The balance printed clearly across the page still reflected a healthy total, the same amount Daniel remembered seeing when he last checked the account during his senior year of high school. Margaret explained that the statements had stopped arriving about a year ago. At the time, she had assumed the bank had simply switched to digital notifications or that Daniel's parents were managing the communication directly. She had not questioned it further because nothing about their family had ever suggested the need for suspicion. Daniel studied the document carefully. The realization settled gradually in his mind that the timeline did not match the explanation his father had given at the dinner table. If the statements had shown the full balance 18 months earlier, and if the transfers Daniel saw online stretched back nearly 2 years, then someone had quietly arranged for those changes to remain unnoticed. Margaret leaned back in her chair and folded her hands again, her posture calm but thoughtful. She said that in a small town like Willow Creek, people often believe complicated problems only happen somewhere else, in larger cities or in distant families they had never met. But she had lived long enough to know that misunderstandings sometimes grew quietly when nobody asked the right questions. Daniel felt the weight of her words settle over the room. He had come to her house expecting sympathy and perhaps advice about what to do next. Instead, he was beginning to understand that his grandmother had already begun examining the situation with a careful attention to detail. Margaret then said something that made Daniel sit a little straighter in his chair. She told him that before drawing any conclusions, she intended to confirm the full history of the account directly with the financial office that had helped establish it years earlier. The records would show exactly when the withdrawals began and who had authorized them. Daniel looked down again at the printed statement and then back at his grandmother. For the first time since the dinner conversation the night before, the confusion he felt was slowly being replaced by something steadier. Not anger and not frustration, but the growing sense that the story was far from finished and that Margaret Carter was not the type of person who allowed unanswered details to remain unexplored. Daniel Carter left his grandmother's house later that afternoon with the quiet feeling that the ground beneath his life was slowly shifting, not through sudden arguments or loud confrontations, but through careful questions that were beginning to uncover details nobody had expected to examine. The late sunlight stretched across the streets of Willow Creek as he drove back toward his parents' house, passing the familiar storefronts near the town square and the small library where he had studied countless evenings during high school. Everything in town looked exactly the same as it always had, which made the situation feel even stranger. For years, Daniel had believed his future was planned carefully, supported by savings his family had promised would be there when he needed them. Now that certainty had quietly disappeared, replaced by documents and timelines that suggested a much more complicated story. When Daniel arrived home, the house looked calm and ordinary. His father's truck sat in the driveway, and the front porch light had already turned on automatically as evening approached. Daniel stepped inside and found his mother standing at the kitchen counter organizing groceries into the refrigerator. She greeted him politely, asking how his afternoon had been as if nothing unusual had happened the night before. Daniel answered briefly and walked upstairs to his room. He did not mention the documents Margaret had shown him or the questions she planned to investigate. Instead, he sat again at his desk and opened the laptop, scrolling slowly through the transaction history that had unsettled him the night before. This time he studied each line more carefully. The withdrawals had not happened all at once. They were spaced out across months, sometimes small transfers, sometimes larger ones, each labeled in a way that looked routine unless someone was paying close attention. Daniel realized that if he had not checked the balance recently, he might not have noticed the pattern at all. It was the kind of quiet change that could pass unnoticed in a busy household where people trusted one another completely. As he continued examining the list, he noticed something else that made him pause. Several transfers were marked with the name of a financial office located just outside the courthouse square in Willow Creek. Daniel recognized the place immediately. It was the same office his grandmother had mentioned earlier that afternoon. He leaned back slowly in the chair, connecting the details one by one. If Margaret contacted that office, the staff there would likely have records of every authorization connected to the account. That meant the timeline would become very clear very quickly. The thought brought a strange mixture of relief and uncertainty. Daniel had spent the entire morning trying to understand why his parents had made the decision they described at the dinner table. But now the situation seemed to be shifting away from explanations and toward evidence. Downstairs he could hear the quiet sounds of dinner being prepared again, the familiar rhythm of cabinets opening and dishes being placed on the counter. For the first time Daniel realized how carefully ordinary the household still felt, as if the previous conversation had already been placed aside. Yet the folder sitting on Margaret Carter's kitchen table suggested that the story was not finished. She had lived in Willow Creek long enough to understand how records were kept and how details surfaced when someone began asking the right questions. Daniel closed the laptop slowly and looked once more at the darkening sky outside his window. Somewhere across town his grandmother was likely preparing for the next step in a process that would reveal exactly how the account had changed and who had authorized every single withdrawal. And Daniel understood that once those answers appeared, the quiet explanation he had been given the night before might no longer be enough. The following morning in Willow Creek began quietly, the pale autumn sunlight stretching across the quiet streets as Daniel Carter sat at the small kitchen table, staring into a cup of coffee that had already grown cold. The house was unusually silent. His father had already left for work at the hardware distribution warehouse outside town, and his mother had gone to the grocery store early, leaving the familiar home strangely empty. Daniel had not slept well. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the transaction history on his laptop screen and heard his grandmother's calm voice explaining the conditions attached to the $50,000 deposit she had made years earlier. The silence of the house gave him too much time to think. He opened his laptop again and studied the list of transfers once more, tracing the dates carefully as if the numbers themselves might reveal something he had missed before. The pattern still felt deliberate. Withdrawals spaced months apart, each one small enough to appear routine, but together forming a steady disappearance of the entire fund. Daniel wondered how long it had taken for the balance to reach zero, and how many conversations had happened in this very house, while the account quietly changed behind the scenes. His phone vibrated suddenly on the table beside him. The screen displayed a message from Margaret Carter. She asked if he had time to stop by the courthouse square later that morning because she had already begun making inquiries. Daniel felt a sudden shift in his chest as he read the message. His grandmother moved quickly when she decided something needed attention. He replied immediately that he would be there. Less than 30 minutes later, Daniel was driving toward the center of town again, passing the same familiar buildings he had known his entire life. Willow Creek was the kind of place where most people knew one another by name and where business offices often shared the same locations for decades. The financial office Margaret had mentioned sat on the corner of Main Street across from the courthouse lawn, a modest brick building with tall windows and a polished brass sign beside the door. Daniel parked along the curb and stepped onto the sidewalk just as Margaret Carter emerged from the entrance. She greeted him with the same calm expression she had worn the previous afternoon, but Daniel noticed the subtle satisfaction in her eyes that suggested she had already learned something important. They walked together toward a bench beneath the large oak tree near the courthouse steps, a place where residents often sat to talk during quiet afternoons. Margaret placed her folder on the bench between them and opened it slowly. Inside were several new papers that had not been there the day before. She explained that the staff inside the office had been very cooperative once she explained her connection to the original deposit. According to the records they had reviewed, the withdrawals from the education account had indeed begun nearly 2 years earlier. Each authorization had been submitted through the same contact person listed on the account management file. Daniel listened carefully as she spoke, feeling the quiet weight of the conversation settle over the sunny courthouse lawn. Margaret paused before revealing the final detail she had learned that morning. She looked directly at her grandson and said that every single withdrawal request had been approved under the authority of Robert Carter, the co-manager listed on the account when it had first been established. Daniel sat very still as the information settled into place. The numbers he had seen on the laptop screen now had a clear explanation attached to them. The quiet decision described at the dinner table had not happened suddenly. It had unfolded gradually, month by month, with official authorizations that traced back to one familiar name. Margaret closed the folder gently and rested her hands on top of it. The courthouse clock began striking the hour behind them. And in that quiet moment, Daniel understood that the story his parents had told him was only the beginning of a much larger truth that was now becoming impossible to ignore. Daniel Carter remained seated on the wooden bench beneath the courthouse oak tree long after the clock finished striking the hour. The sound faded slowly into the quiet morning air of Willow Creek, leaving behind the distant hum of cars passing through Main Street and the occasional footsteps of people crossing the courthouse lawn. Margaret Carter closed the folder carefully beside him, but the information inside it seemed to remain hanging in the air between them. Daniel looked out across the square, watching a man unlock the door to the small barber shop and a pair of elderly neighbors chatting near the fountain. Everything looked peaceful, the same small-town rhythm he had known his entire life. Yet the calm setting made the discovery feel even more surreal. According to the records Margaret had just reviewed, every withdrawal from the education account had been approved through formal requests submitted under Robert Carter's authority as co-manager of the account. That meant the steady disappearance of the money had not been an accident or a misunderstanding. It had been a series of deliberate actions stretching back nearly 2 years. Daniel took a slow breath, trying to organize the thoughts racing quietly through his mind. He remembered the many evenings during those same 2 years when he had been working late shifts at the hardware store, stacking paint cans and helping customers carry lumber to their trucks while believing his college plans were secure. The contrast between those long hours of effort and the quiet transactions now documented in Margaret's folder made the situation feel strangely distant, as if 2 different timelines had been unfolding at the same time without ever intersecting. Margaret watched her grandson thoughtfully before speaking again. Her voice remained calm, but Daniel could hear the careful precision in the way she chose her words. She explained that the financial office had also provided one additional detail about the account. Each withdrawal request had been submitted with a brief description explaining the purpose of the transfer. At first, the explanations were vague phrases such as educational expenses or tuition planning adjustments. But as the months passed, the descriptions had changed. Some transfers were labeled as housing support and academic preparation costs connected to Ethan Carter. Daniel turned toward her slowly when he heard his brother's name spoken out loud in that quiet setting. The courthouse lawn suddenly felt larger and quieter than before. Margaret continued gently, explaining that the office staff had simply processed the requests because the account manager listed on the file had proper authorization. From their perspective, everything had appeared routine. Daniel nodded faintly, understanding that the people in the office had only followed the documentation presented to them. Still, the pattern was becoming clearer with every new detail. The quiet explanation offered at the dinner table now seemed incomplete compared to the careful record of transactions stretching across months and years. Margaret placed the folder back into her bag and stood up slowly, brushing a few fallen leaves from the wooden bench. She looked down at Daniel with the same calm certainty she had carried throughout the morning. She said that facts had a way of arranging themselves clearly once someone gathered enough information. The documents from the financial office were only the first piece of the puzzle. There were still other details that needed to be understood before any decisions were made. Daniel rose from the bench as well, feeling the steady clarity of the situation settling into his mind. The quiet streets of Willow Creek looked exactly the same as they had earlier that morning, but the story unfolding behind those familiar storefronts had begun to take a shape that could no longer be ignored. Daniel Carter and Margaret Carter walked slowly across the courthouse lawn toward the parking area along Main Street. The late morning sunlight casting long shadows across the grass, while the quiet rhythm of Willow Creek continued around them, as if nothing unusual had happened. People moved in and out of the nearby shops, and a delivery truck rolled past the bakery on the corner, the driver waving casually to a group of regular customers standing outside with coffee cups in their hands. To anyone watching, it would have looked like an ordinary morning in a peaceful small town. But Daniel felt the quiet weight of the information his grandmother had gathered settling more firmly in his mind with every step they took. The records from the financial office had confirmed something important. The withdrawals from the education account had not only been deliberate, they had been consistent and carefully documented under Robert Carter's authority. That meant the story Daniel had been given at the dinner table was only the simplest explanation of something that had unfolded gradually over time. Margaret reached her car first and paused beside the door before turning back toward her grandson. She opened her bag again and removed the folder containing the documents from the office. Daniel noticed that she handled the papers with the same calm precision she had shown throughout the morning, as if she were assembling pieces of a puzzle rather than reacting emotionally to what they revealed. She explained that the staff at the financial office had provided copies of the most recent transfer authorizations. Each document included a date, a reference number, and a brief description explaining the purpose of the transaction. Daniel leaned slightly closer as she showed him the pages. One transfer described housing support for Ethan Carter. Another referred to tuition preparation costs connected to medical school applications. Several earlier withdrawals simply listed academic planning adjustments. When Daniel looked carefully at the sequence of dates, he noticed that the transfers had become larger during the past 12 months. Margaret pointed quietly to one particular line near the bottom of the page. The amount listed there was nearly $30,000, transferred only 8 months earlier. The description again mentioned Ethan Carter's academic preparation expenses. Daniel felt a quiet realization settle in his chest as he studied the number. The pattern of transactions was no longer vague or confusing. The money had moved steadily from one future into another, documented step by step in official records. Margaret closed the folder gently and placed it back inside her bag. She spoke with the same thoughtful calm she had maintained all morning. She said that before drawing any conclusions, she wanted to gather one more piece of information. According to the staff inside the office, the most recent authorization request had included a forwarding note indicating where the transferred funds had ultimately been directed. The note listed a property management company located in Columbus, Ohio. Daniel looked at her with quiet surprise. Columbus was more than 2 hours away from Willow Creek. Margaret nodded slowly, explaining that the reference suggested the funds might have been connected to housing arrangements for Ethan while he prepared for medical school. Daniel stared out across the street for a moment, imagining the long line of transactions stretching from the small financial office in their hometown all the way to a property company in a much larger city. The picture forming in his mind was no longer just about tuition or education expenses. It suggested a much broader plan that had been unfolding quietly for months. Margaret placed a reassuring hand on Daniel's shoulder before opening her car door. She said that understanding the full story required patience and careful attention to facts. The documents they had gathered so far were only the beginning. And in a town like Willow Creek, where records were kept carefully and people remembered details longer than they expected, the rest of the story would eventually become clear. Daniel Carter watched as Margaret Carter closed the car door and slowly drove away from the courthouse square, leaving him standing beside the quiet sidewalk on Main Street with a growing sense that the situation had moved far beyond the simple explanation he had heard at the dinner table 2 nights earlier. The autumn air carried the faint smell of fresh bread from the bakery across the street, while the steady flow of daily life continued around him. A man walked his dog past the courthouse fountain, and a group of teenagers laughed as they crossed the street toward the diner where Daniel himself had spent so many afternoons after school. Everything in Willow Creek appeared calm and predictable, yet Daniel now understood that the story unfolding behind the familiar buildings was anything but simple. He began walking slowly toward his car, replaying the details Margaret had shared only moments earlier. The financial records had revealed a clear timeline of withdrawals stretching across nearly 2 years, all approved through his father's authority as co-manager of the account. At first, the transactions had been small enough to seem harmless, labeled as routine academic planning adjustments. But over time, the transfers had grown larger, eventually totaling the entire amount that had once been reserved for Daniel's education. What unsettled him most was the final detail Margaret had mentioned before leaving. One of the most recent transfers had been linked to a property management company located in Columbus, Ohio. The idea lingered in Daniel's thoughts as he unlocked his car and sat quietly behind the steering wheel. Columbus was not just another nearby town. It was a large city nearly 120 miles away, a place where Ethan had mentioned several times he might eventually study medicine. Daniel stared through the windshield at the courthouse lawn while the pieces began to fit together more clearly. If the funds had been redirected toward housing in Columbus, then the plan had likely been in motion long before anyone had told Daniel the account was empty. The thought made the dinner conversation feel even more distant and incomplete. Daniel started the engine and drove slowly back toward the residential streets of Willow Creek. The familiar houses passed by one after another, each with neatly trimmed lawns and front porches where neighbors often sat in the evenings. When he turned onto the street where his parents lived, he noticed something that made him pause. A dark sedan was parked in the driveway beside his father's truck, a car Daniel did not recognize. As he pulled closer, he saw his father and mother standing near the front porch speaking with a tall man dressed in a gray suit. The three of them appeared deep in conversation, their voices low and serious. Daniel parked along the curb and stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching beneath his shoes as he approached the house. His father looked up first, his expression shifting briefly when he noticed Daniel walking toward them. The man in the gray suit turned as well and offered a polite nod. Robert Carter cleared his throat and introduced the visitor calmly as Mr. Howard Blake, a financial consultant who had been helping the family review certain arrangements related to Ethan's upcoming plans in Columbus. Daniel listened carefully as the introduction settled into the quiet afternoon air. The name sounded familiar. Only a few hours earlier, his grandmother had mentioned contacting professionals who understood the details of financial records and account authorizations. Now a consultant connected to those same arrangements was standing in the driveway of the Carter home. Daniel glanced briefly toward the house, then back at the man in the gray suit. The situation was beginning to reveal new layers, and for the first time he realized that the quiet investigation Margaret Carter had started might soon intersect directly with the decisions his parents had already put into motion. Daniel Carter stood quietly in the driveway as Robert Carter finished introducing the man in the gray suit. Mr. Howard Blake offered a polite handshake, his expression calm and professional in a way that suggested he was used to conversations about financial planning and long-term decisions. Daniel returned the greeting but said very little, choosing instead to observe the interaction unfolding in front of him. The late afternoon sun hung low above the rooftops of Willow Creek, casting long shadows across the quiet street, while a light breeze moved through the trees lining the neighborhood. It was the same peaceful environment Daniel had known since childhood, yet the presence of the unfamiliar consultant made the moment feel unusually formal. Robert Carter spoke first, explaining that Mr. Blake had been helping the family review certain arrangements connected to Ethan's future plans. According to his father, the process involved organizing housing and financial support, while Ethan prepared for the next stage of his education in Columbus. Daniel listened carefully, his thoughts immediately returning to the documents Margaret Carter had shown him earlier that morning. The reference to a property management company in Columbus suddenly felt far less abstract. Linda Carter stood beside her husband with a composed expression, occasionally nodding as Mr. Blake described the importance of planning ahead when supporting a student entering a demanding program, such as medical school. His tone was smooth and reassuring, the type of explanation that likely sounded responsible and practical to anyone hearing it for the first time. Daniel noticed that both of his parents appeared comfortable with the conversation, as if the arrangements had already been discussed many times before this moment. After a few minutes, Mr. Blake glanced toward Daniel with polite curiosity and asked whether he had already heard about Ethan's housing plans in Columbus. The question seemed simple on the surface, yet Daniel felt the quiet weight behind it. He answered carefully, saying that he had only recently learned a few details about the financial changes connected to Ethan's preparations. Robert Carter shifted slightly beside the porch steps, clearing his throat before speaking again. He explained that the family had been making adjustments over the past couple of years to ensure Ethan would have the support necessary to pursue his medical career. According to him, the decisions had been made with the long-term future of the family in mind. Daniel remained calm as he listened, though the timeline his father mentioned echoed clearly with the records Margaret had uncovered at the financial office. Nearly 2 years. The same period during which the education account had slowly been emptied through a series of authorized withdrawals. Mr. Blake nodded thoughtfully as Robert spoke, adding that housing near major universities often required early arrangements because demand could increase quickly once the academic year approached. He described a small apartment complex in Columbus that had recently become available and suggested that securing a place early could provide stability for Ethan while he focused on his studies. Daniel glanced briefly at his parents, then back at the consultant. The pieces of the situation were beginning to align with surprising clarity. The financial transfers Margaret had documented earlier were no longer just numbers on a page. They were part of a carefully organized plan that had been unfolding quietly long before Daniel had realized anything was changing. As the conversation continued near the porch steps, Daniel understood something important. His parents believed they had simply explained their decision at the dinner table. But the records, the documents, and now the consultant standing in the driveway all suggested a much longer story that had been building quietly behind the scenes for nearly 2 years. Daniel Carter remained standing in the driveway while the conversation with Mr. Howard Blake continued in the calm, professional tone that seemed almost disconnected from the tension quietly building beneath the surface. The consultant spoke with the confidence of someone accustomed to explaining financial decisions to families who believed they were planning responsibly for the future. He described housing options near the university in Columbus and mentioned that the apartment complex he had referenced earlier was located within a short drive of the medical campus Ethan hoped to attend. According to him, securing the lease early would prevent unnecessary complications once the academic year began. Robert Carter nodded as he listened, occasionally adding small comments about how important stability would be for Ethan during such a demanding period of study. Linda Carter stood beside them with a polite smile that appeared carefully maintained, as though the discussion were simply another routine step in supporting their younger son's ambitions. Daniel listened quietly while the words settled into place around him. Each explanation sounded logical when presented on its own. Housing near a university, financial preparation, long-term planning. Yet the calm language did not erase the details Daniel had already seen in the documents Margaret Carter had collected that morning. The transfers from the education account had not been abstract adjustments. They had been the financial foundation for the very arrangements Mr. Blake was now describing. The same funds that once represented Daniel's opportunity to attend college had gradually been redirected toward building a different path for Ethan. Mr. Blake eventually glanced toward Daniel again, his expression friendly but curious. He said that families sometimes had to make complex decisions when supporting more than one child through higher education. In his experience, these choices often required balancing available resources with the opportunities that appeared most promising. Daniel noticed that his father remained silent during that part of the explanation, looking instead toward the quiet street as a car passed slowly along the curb. The moment stretched briefly before Robert Carter spoke again. He repeated that the family had acted with the intention of giving Ethan the best possible start as he pursued a career in medicine. The tone of his voice suggested he believed the reasoning should be self-evident. Daniel nodded slightly, but did not respond immediately. His thoughts returned once again to the timeline Margaret had uncovered. Nearly 2 years of carefully documented withdrawals. Nearly 2 years during which his parents had continued speaking about the future as if nothing had changed. The realization made the present conversation feel less like a sudden explanation and more like the final chapter of a plan that had already been carried out. After several more minutes, Mr. Blake checked his watch and mentioned that he needed to return to his office before the end of the afternoon. He thanked Robert and Linda for their time and shook Daniel's hand once more before walking toward the sedan parked in the driveway. The quiet rumble of the engine faded as he pulled away from the house and turned onto the street. For a moment, the three members of the Carter family remained standing near the porch without speaking. The neighborhood looked exactly as it always had, calm and ordinary under the fading sunlight. But Daniel now understood something clearly. The explanations offered in the driveway were not revealing new decisions. They were simply describing the outcome of choices that had been made long ago, choices that were only now beginning to come fully into view. Daniel Carter stood quietly near the porch steps as the sound of Mr. Howard Blake's car disappeared down the street, leaving the neighborhood once again wrapped in the calm stillness of a late afternoon in Willow Creek. The golden light of the setting sun stretched across the lawns of the surrounding houses, and somewhere nearby a lawn sprinkler clicked rhythmically as it turned across a patch of grass. Robert Carter remained near the driveway with his hands resting loosely on his hips, watching the empty street for a moment before turning back toward the house. Linda Carter adjusted the sleeve of her sweater and glanced briefly at Daniel with an expression that seemed both careful and measured, as if she were deciding what should be said next. For a few seconds, none of them spoke. The quiet felt heavier now that the consultant had left, as though the professional explanations that had filled the conversation moments earlier had also taken away the buffer that kept the family from addressing the situation directly. Daniel finally broke the silence in a calm voice. He asked a simple question about when the planning for Ethan's move to Columbus had actually begun. Robert Carter exhaled slowly before answering. He explained that the discussions had started nearly 2 years earlier when Ethan began preparing his applications for medical school. At the time, the family believed that arranging stable housing and financial support early would give him the best chance to focus on his studies without unnecessary distractions. Daniel listened carefully as his father spoke, recognizing how closely the timeline matched the pattern of withdrawals he had seen in the financial records that morning. Nearly 2 years. The same period Margaret Carter had identified when reviewing the account history. Linda stepped closer to the porch railing and added that the decisions had never been meant to cause tension within the family. She explained that opportunities sometimes appeared unexpectedly and that responsible parents had to think carefully about how to support them. Her tone remained calm, but Daniel noticed that she avoided looking directly at him while she spoke. The explanation sounded thoughtful and reasonable on the surface, yet the quiet details Daniel now understood made the conversation feel incomplete. He remembered the folder resting on Margaret Carter's kitchen table and the clear documentation showing exactly when the account had begun to change. The financial office had confirmed that the withdrawals were authorized one by one under Robert Carter's name, each step moving a little more of the education fund away from the future Daniel had believed was waiting for him. Robert eventually looked at his older son again and spoke in a steady voice. He said that families sometimes had to make decisions that might not seem fair at first, but were meant to benefit everyone in the long run. According to him, Ethan's path toward medicine represented an investment that could eventually support the entire family in ways they could not yet fully imagine. Daniel listened without interrupting. The evening air had grown cooler, and the distant sound of a passing train drifted faintly through the town. He understood now that his parents believed they had acted responsibly according to their own reasoning. But the careful investigation Margaret Carter had begun that morning suggested the situation involved more than simply choosing one opportunity over another. It involved records, agreements, and a deposit that had been placed into the account with specific conditions attached. As the last light of the sun faded behind the houses on the street, Daniel realized that the quiet conversation unfolding in the driveway was only one part of a much larger story that had been developing quietly behind the scenes, and that story was far from finished. The quiet street gradually settled into evening as Daniel Carter stepped onto the porch and followed his parents inside the house, the familiar creak of the wooden floor echoing softly beneath his shoes. The living room lights were already on, casting a warm glow across the same furniture that had filled the house for as long as Daniel could remember. Family photographs lined the shelves along the wall, showing birthdays, graduations, and holidays that once seemed simple and uncomplicated. Daniel paused for a moment as he looked at one particular photo of himself and Ethan standing together at a high school football game several years earlier. At the time, everything had felt balanced and predictable, as if the future of both brothers had been carefully supported by the same foundation. Now the memory carried a different weight. Robert Carter walked into the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water, while Linda Carter began preparing dinner as though the evening were unfolding normally. The quiet routine of everyday life continued around Daniel in a way that felt strangely disconnected from the conversation that had taken place outside only minutes earlier. Finally, Robert leaned against the kitchen counter and spoke again in the same steady tone he had used throughout the afternoon. He said that he understood the situation might seem difficult for Daniel to accept, but the decisions made over the past 2 years had been based on careful thought about what would benefit the family long term. According to him, Ethan's acceptance into a demanding medical program required a level of financial preparation that had to begin well before the official start of classes. Daniel listened without interrupting, his thoughts returning once more to the documents Margaret Carter had shown him earlier that day. The financial records had clearly listed the sequence of withdrawals authorized under Robert's name, each transfer gradually shifting the entire education fund away from the purpose it had originally been created to serve. Linda placed a pot on the stove and turned toward Daniel with a calm expression. She explained that the family had believed the adjustments would eventually make sense once Ethan established his career. In her view, the investment in medical school represented an opportunity that might support everyone in the future. Daniel nodded slowly as he heard the explanation repeated once again. The reasoning sounded consistent with what they had already said, yet the quiet investigation Margaret had begun suggested there were still important details left unspoken. He walked toward the window, overlooking the backyard where the evening sky had begun turning deep shades of orange and blue. The familiar maple tree near the fence swayed gently in the breeze while the distant sound of a passing car moved through the neighborhood. For a moment, the house felt suspended between two different realities. One was the ordinary routine his parents continued to maintain, speaking about practical decisions and future success. The other was the growing collection of records and documents that revealed exactly how those decisions had unfolded behind the scenes over the course of nearly 2 years. Daniel turned back toward the kitchen as the quiet sounds of dinner preparation filled the room. He understood now that the conversation inside the Carter home was only one version of the story. Across town, Margaret Carter had already begun gathering the facts that would eventually reveal the entire timeline with complete clarity. And once those details were fully assembled, the explanations offered around this kitchen table might no longer be enough to settle the questions that had already begun to surface. Daniel Carter sat quietly at the kitchen table while the soft clatter of dishes and the low hum of the stove filled the room. Dinner unfolded with the same routine movements that had defined evenings in the Carter house for years. Linda Carter placed plates on the table and asked simple questions about work and errands, her tone calm and composed as if the conversation earlier in the driveway had already been resolved. Robert Carter spoke occasionally about a shipment arriving at the warehouse later that week, discussing schedules and delivery times in the steady voice he used whenever he talked about work. To anyone listening from outside the room, it would have sounded like an ordinary family dinner in a quiet American town. Yet Daniel felt the weight of everything he had learned that day resting quietly behind each word. The folder Margaret Carter had shown him that morning remained vivid in his memory. The documents had not been emotional or dramatic. They had simply presented facts, dates, authorization numbers, transfers, each one carefully recorded as the balance of the education account slowly declined. Daniel watched his parents across the table and wondered how many evenings had unfolded exactly like this during the 2 years those withdrawals had been taking place. How many dinners had been shared while the plan for Ethan's future quietly moved forward step by step. Linda eventually noticed Daniel's silence and looked toward him with a small encouraging smile. She said that she understood the adjustment might take time and that sometimes life required unexpected changes. According to her, families supported one another by focusing on the opportunities that would bring the greatest long-term benefit. Daniel nodded slightly, but did not offer a response. His thoughts drifted again to the courthouse square earlier that day where Margaret Carter had calmly reviewed the records provided by the financial office. Her voice had remained steady while she explained the timeline of the account and the conditions attached to the deposit she had personally contributed years earlier. Those conditions had been written clearly into the original paperwork. The funds were meant for Daniel's education. Robert set his glass of water down on the table and spoke again, his tone firm but measured. He said that the situation had been carefully considered and that sometimes responsible decisions required difficult choices. In his view, Ethan's path toward medicine represented an investment that would eventually strengthen the entire family. Daniel listened carefully. The reasoning sounded familiar now, repeated with quiet confidence. Yet the more he heard it, the more he realized that his parents believed the matter had already been settled long before the conversation at dinner 2 nights earlier. From their perspective, the decision had simply been explained after it was complete. Daniel looked toward the window where the evening darkness had fully settled across the backyard. The faint glow of the porch light illuminated the wooden fence and the branches of the old maple tree swaying gently in the breeze. Somewhere across town, Margaret Carter was likely still reviewing the documents she had gathered that morning, considering what they revealed about the account and the conditions that had been attached to it from the beginning. Daniel understood something clearly now. The quiet routine of dinner inside the Carter house might suggest that everything had already been decided. But the records Margaret had uncovered told a story that was only beginning to unfold, and the truth contained within those pages had not yet reached its final chapter.